Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good night, good morning, whatever you are watching this podcast. Robert Vane's podcast, this time about a text that was produced on the Hegel Courses site. I will show you that in a minute. And I'm very excited to have a guest today who will introduce himself. We're going to do this whole thing together. We're going to take a look at the text that I wrote on the Hegel Courses site, and we're going to listen a little bit about something that I'm very excited about lately, which is Notebook LM. That is a Google AI study assistant, and it works pretty well, and it allows you to produce kind of a dialogue. It's called a deep dive, a dialogue between a man and a woman discussing the material that you have presented in the Notebook LM. And I'm quite excited about it because it's pretty good, actually. But just to figure out if it's really very good, we're going to take a look at it together, Sehwan Park and I. And if he will rectify his microphone again, then we will start. Hi, Sehwan. Nice to see you here
Greetings,
in this
hello
conference.
everyone. I'm Sehwan Park from South Korea, Seoul, and I'm very excited to participate in today's program. Thank you.
Maybe we should say to all the listeners and viewers that this is the first attempt that we have now made
Oh,
to
certainly.
make a conversation together about the things that we are talking about weekly
Yes,
lately.
indeed.
It's a discussion about building and dwelling and thinking. Actually, is the complete title of one of Heidegger's essays, written, I believe, Sehwan, in 1951, as I recall.
Yes,
Um,
I believe so.
yeah.
Yes.
It's considered to be part of the late Heidegger, the third period in Heidegger's work, and we find it quite fascinating. And on the Hegel courses site, which I will show you in a minute, um, I have written a little piece about that essay by Heidegger. At least I hope I can show it now. There we go. Ah, there it is. So here you have the Hegel courses site, and there's a lot about Hegel, of course, philosophy of right. Hegel studies on Vimeo, not many of them because I changed it to YouTube. So the most of these Hegel studies can be found on YouTube, and also on the hegelcourses.wordpress.com website. But all of this probably you know about. Building Dwelling Thinking by Heidegger. Okay, there we have it. So it's about the relationship between building and dwelling. And as we will notice, Heidegger has very peculiar ideas about building and dwelling. Let's dive into the key concepts here, to start with dwelling and being, and then we will discover that he has this weird idea, I think weird to some degree, about the
Yes.
so-called fourfold. Um, well, say one, we talked about that yesterday, the idea of das Geviert in German, the fourfold. Let's
Yes,
first
indeed.
read this first paragraph. So, the essential nature of being human is to dwell on earth, to have a place to live, I suppose. Um, that's different from what we have been reading in Being in Time, right?
Yeah,
This
definitely.
concept of Dasein, being somewhere, being in, it was never explained as dwelling in Being in Time. The book
Yeah, the new terminology, I
1927.
would say, is very interesting that he introduces such a term, which I believe has a more poetic tone, very different from
Sure, yeah.
his, yeah, phenomenologically rigorous work in Being and Time, I would say, in contrast. Yes, certainly. So,
It's like later in his career, he started thinking again about what it meant to being in the world,
yeah, indeed.
and then this notion of dwelling came up. The essential nature of being human is to dwell on the earth. And then he says, just like he also says in Being in Time, and being in is not being in a place or in space. A dwelling is not just residing in a place, but a way of existing in relation to, and there we have it, the fourfold of earth, sky, divinities, and mortals. So we have to unpack, I think, this idea of the
Yeah, right.
fourfold. And then this addition to dwell is to be at peace, to be preserved from harm, to exist in a free relationship with the fourfold. So that's a lot of terminology that is new. Um,
Yeah, indeed.
if you read Side on Side to Being in Time, you have no idea what this could mean, right? I mean, there's no explanation of the fourfold in Being in Time and in the earlier essays.
Yeah,
Although
exactly.
I think this guy Mitchell that I quoted here, this guy Mitchell is convinced that it's also in the lectures of 1941, 1942.
Oh,
So he has
interesting.
an earlier source for that. And yeah, you might argue that Heidegger done some preparatory, has some preparatory ideas that were active in the 30s, 1930s, and 1940s. But okay. So the fourfold, the interconnectedness of earth, sky, divinities, and mortals. So um, dwelling means to exist within this, yeah, this structure of four elements. Um, what do you make of that? What at first glance, what would something like Earth actually mean here?
I think it might mean something that we experience very often and every single minute we inhabit the world, because we first have a house, we have a residence,
Yeah,
and then around the house you have objects such as trees, the nature, or even artificial constructions that are supposed to characterize our life in a certain way. And we engage with them all the time: traffic signals, trees, and also industrial sources from which we gain our resources and also goods necessary to sustain our existence. So I would
yeah.
say this, very broadly speaking, refers to all elements that surround us all the time and give meaning to us and also really fuel our life, so to speak, because without
No,
these
I'm
elements,
not
yeah,
sure that it is about giving meaning to us yet, but
yeah,
I
right,
agree with you. It's about the conditions of living, right? The
yeah,
earth
yes,
giving food to us, and the earth giving us a solid place to stay. And he's obviously not thinking about earthquakes or forest fires or whatever else can happen
yeah,
with
for
the earth,
sure,
but um, all of the things that make our life possible and that are part of our taking care of ourselves. And interesting enough, I also think it's about taking care of the earth. So there's this ecological idea also that if
yeah,
the earth
indeed,
is the condition of our survival, we should take care of the earth and not pollute it and stuff. There's some kind of ecological element here, I believe.
definitely, I agree.
Uh, so there, we have it about the earth. We take care of the earth, receiving the sky. What could that possibly mean? Receiving the sky. There's something about this vertical dimension of the openness above us that is important to us. The air we breathe, maybe
Yeah,
space we inhabit. We can look from afar, see a mountain.
yeah,
Sky, of course, is important. The open skies have a peculiar experience instead of living in some kind of a cave or in an apartment building, and we're
yeah,
sort
indeed.
of closed off from the sky. But I'm not sure yet what sky exactly means, but something like the openness in a vertical dimension. We stand on
Yeah,
the earth within the openness of the sky. Uh, Or maybe the sky, if you think back to our discussions about the open place in the forest, the lichting,
oh, yeah.
maybe that has something to do with sky, the revelation of things within the light that comes from the sky. What about the next one? Awaiting the divinities. They're not there yet, but there's a kind of openness for divine names and ideas and meanings to appear, something like that. Um, And yeah, and then the fourth element was, it says here, initiating their own being. Um, but the mortality, the acceptance of our mortality was basically the fourth element. Um, and he has, but we will hear about that also in the discussion that was generated by notebook LM. But this idea of a bridge, I like that as a kind of an example. So imagine that you're building a bridge to connect two sides of a river. Well, the bridge has something to do with earth, connecting parts of the earth, and it's also something that you can walk on. So that's the earth element. Um, yeah, receiving the sky is not that clear. Waiting the divinities is not that clear. Of course, mortals are making use of the bridge, but you might, yeah, I mean, it takes some imagination, I believe. But receiving the sky and awaiting the divinities should also be connected with building a bridge. Maybe the bridge stands out in the sky, which is part of its appearance.
Yeah,
And awaiting the divinities, the bridge must have some kind of a meaning, maybe connecting two parts of one community with each other. Um, so everything that is supposed to appear within these this fourfold that Heidegger describes. Um, what do you think about that? Is that a nice way to describe our world, or would you say there is something beyond this fourfold that needs to be thought about as well?
I would say the four elements are not immediately apparent when we reflect on our life in the 21st century, when many people inhabit urban cities and live really immersed, I would say, in a very fast paced urban attitude, and the element of sky might even be buried by the urban landscape. You can't really gaze
Ah,
up to the sky or
well, you
feel
can't
the
see it. Yeah,
yeah, in a simplistic manner. And even the element of ours, I would say, is very vague when we live in city and therefore are surrounded by concrete buildings all the time. And likewise, the element of divinity seem to have been somehow concealed by the very modern scientific positivist attitude as well. And likewise, this, I think, explanation can also be applied to the mortals. But I think even when we, from our perspective in this very era, the fourfold structure seems not to be very immediately evident. This does not necessarily mean that Heidegger was speaking nonsense, because when we have a look at the ideal lifestyle he tries to understand, that is maybe the lifestyle of a farmer who engages in the soil and nurtures it and therefore grows crops and really
it's
lives,
totally
I would
different. Yeah,
say,
totally
yeah, in
different
a very
experience.
different lifestyle. The
Yeah.
fourfold can perhaps be better understood in terms of rural lifestyle that is based on a more traditional way of living. So when we try to adopt that perspective, I think the four elements become pretty obvious.
I mean, it seems obvious that Heidegger is criticizing our technological way of dwelling right now, because
Yeah,
the
indeed.
way we dwell is, I like very much the way you put it. Um, the way we dwell in a city is to cover the earth instead of allowing it
Yes, it,
to be. We yeah, almost exactly and concretely we.
yeah,
Um, yeah, we get rid of the sky. The sky is no longer something that we really experience in the
yeah,
city.
indeed.
And awaiting the divinities, yeah, where is there time and space to await the divinities? Whereas in cities, you might have forms of religion that are very strict and rigid and very authoritarian. And awaiting the divinities is a totally different kind of attitude, I suppose. And mortality, well, there's a lot of mortality going on in the city, but that's not what he means, I suppose.
Yeah, for
It's
sure.
like living with your mortality is to maximize your survival options and not take
Yeah,
risk. And everyone who participates in traffic nowadays in the city is taking on a huge risk, actually. So maybe this mortality element also is a, let's say, kind of a criticism of our urban dwelling.
yeah,
But
very much so.
yeah, I think that two things that we might want to talk about a little more. That's the idea of building, of course, that started the whole thing, the building,
Yeah,
dwelling, thinking. There could be something like a technological construction, like using the scenery, the environment, and all sorts of
Mhm.
materials simply as material for some kind of transformation, human technological achievement. And there is another kind of building that makes the result, let's say we build a house, fit in to fit in within the environment and allowing it to be a part of it. Let's say a wooden house in a forest can be constructed in such a way that it um, does not interrupt the life in the forest, actually
Yeah,
um,
indeed.
enhances it, something like that. So that's the building without the emphasis on technological power that we usually have. Um, but how could that be in practice? I mean, you have cities with several million inhabitants.
Mhm.
How could you change that into a spread out community with low tech housing? And I mean, in practice, this would be quite difficult, I think.
Yeah, there
Can
would
you
be a lot
imagine
of
that?
practical challenges because
Yeah,
although the idea of adhering to a very rural lifestyle, not utilizing the earth as it given as a standing reserve that is to be exploited, this attitude,
yeah,
if we try to turn away from this attitude, certainly we would have to challenge the modern notion of urban lifestyle because I think the current urban lifestyle in which everything becomes industrial and also all objects or resources become what are to be exploited simply, but nothing more than that. This attitude is embedded in the notion of city itself. So unless we really come up with a revolutionary way to transform its way of maybe building houses and also connecting houses and building infrastructures in general, it would be very difficult to, I believe,
so that
adhere
is a
to the
job for
Heideggerian notion. I
architects
fear.
and city planners.
Yeah, certainly.
Is it maybe possible to change this emphasis on technological and economic what we could say that rigidity? I mean,
Yeah,
uh,
indeed.
technology allows us to transform everything, and it has to be economical, and those are the only kinds of perspectives that we use. Um, could it be possible that we construct our apartment buildings in such a way that some of this idea of connecting to the sky and connecting to Earth become a reality? I'm not sure about that. There's one word that you use that we might need to elucidate a little bit. Is standing reserve, you said.
Oh, yes, indeed.
Uh, I think, yeah. So that would be bestehendes or stehendes Bestell in German. What do you understand of Heidegger's terminology here? What is a standing reserve?
I adopted the terminology from his critique on technology, which I also
Uh,
believe was written around the similar same time period, because it also
yeah,
comes from the thoughts of late Heidegger. And my understanding of it is that once we adopt a technological attitude in the 21st or late 20th century, we become extremely immersed in forwarding industrial and economic and technological developments and therefore efficiency. Now that objects such as tree, rock, or even river or anything that stands in the nature that previously had its own place and an intrinsic meaning, so to speak, are now entirely transformed into a few that is homogeneous, have no
yeah.
identity, and is just barely left there to be used by us for whatever purposes. So this
So the
radical
standing reserve,
utilitarian
it means that
drive.
it's already determined that it can be used, can be transformed.
Yes,
In that
exactly.
sense, it's in
Yes.
reserve. It has no
Yeah, yeah,
meaning in
indeed.
itself, but yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
we come to the idea of language now.
Oh, I see.
Something that I found very fascinating, that Heidegger talks about the word bouwen, to build, and he says that bouwen originally meant to dwell. That's the etymological origin of the word. So, a building is a living place, and to build is to provide a living space. And wohnen in German, to dwell or to live somewhere, is very much connected to this idea. Actually,
Yeah.
building and living somewhere, wohnen, bouwen and wohnen, are actually, yeah, the same sort of relationship to being. And that is quite interesting what he has to say about all of that. Um, so that original building, um, making something as a living space, is actually the way that we dwell. I mean, we cannot dwell by simply staying out in the open. We need not just the sky, but we need the earth and the divinities, and to be aware of our mortality, etc. We need all of that to go into the whole concept of building. So they are
Certainly.
so connected with each other that they can't be. I mean, because you have building that is not for the purpose of dwelling. So if you build a factory, the factory is not supposed to be a place of dwelling. Now, if building, bouwen, actually basically meant to dwell, you see that there is some kind of technological distortion. It has severed the connection between bouwen and wonen. If we can build not just to dwell somewhere, but we can build just to produce and to enhance our technological means. So I think that is quite interesting. And he writes about that in the essay. Yeah. What I wanted to ask you, um, before we maybe dive into the concept of thinking, just to listen a little bit to a little critique that Hegel might uttered, which is basically this idea that in Hegel's dialectics things are considered to be dynamic, and that in Heidegger's Fourfold the consideration is more static. It's like the four dimensions in which human beings live and in which things appear. And Hegel might say something about this static nature. So shall we listen to it, and then we can? It's only 3 minutes long, and then we can have some comments on it. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Okay. Um, let's go.
I must say that I find Martin Heidegger's concept of the fourfold to be a most intriguing and provocative idea. As I ponder the relationship between the earth, sky, divinities, and mortals, I am reminded of my own dialectical phenomenology, wherein I sought to understand the absolute spirit through the synthesis of opposing forces. In my lectures on the philosophy of history, I spoke of the unity of the universal and the particular, wherein the individual finds their place within the larger context of the world historical process. Heidegger's Fourfold, with its emphasis on the interconnectedness of earth, sky, divinities, and mortals, can be seen as a manifestation of this unity, wherein the particular, the individual, is situated within the universal, the fourfold. However, I must take issue with Heidegger's notion that dwelling is a state of being at peace.
Okay, that's the first part of it. So Hegel seems to be able to agree, at least in this interpretation, that the fourfold expresses something like the universal, as the context of our existence in the world. I'm not sure that the real Hegel would argue like that, but this is a nice attempt to say something positive about the fourfold from an Hegelian perspective.
Yes, for
What do you think about that? Is there a real connection between Hegel's universal and the relationship between the universal and the particular? Does that sound like an interpretation of the fourfold?
Yes, I do believe there is some visible connection because I think in the fourfold, what comes to be the one with priority is the four elements that I believe are larger or embody the more of the element of wholeness in which individual sort of fits in or participates and in harmony participates in being itself. So I do believe that it gains from the whole in a sense and
Mhm.
makes sense of life and so on. So I do believe there is some similarity to be observed.
Yeah, at least superficially, you can already say existing within the fourfold, let's say the
Yeah,
four
indeed.
dimensions of the revelation of being, suggests something like what Hegel would call, of course, the particular existing in the universal. But I think the difference might be that for Heidegger, this fourfold is like a dimension, like an open space in which things appear. And that for Hegel, the fourfold would be something that manifests itself within human beings, in particular, within the human spirit. So there would be a greater emphasis on um, the human subjectivity in all of this. I doubt very much that Hegel would take the mortality or the mortals as one of these four universals. So there's still some things to consider, I think, in comparing the two. But uh, yeah, I can understand at first glance that you should see a connection like this. But now comes Hegel's criticism, um, and it runs like this.
Preserved from harm. Does this not smack of a certain quietism, a resignation to the existing state of affairs? Is this not a forfeiture of the dialectical tension, the dynamic interplay between opposites that drives human history and consciousness forward?
So he is criticizing, yeah, the static nature of it all. There's no contradiction that is at work here. It's a sort of the description of a space in which human beings exist, and it has four of these corners, four elements in it. Um, is that also at first glance? Is that a powerful criticism? Do you think something that we,
Hmm.
or did he
Yes, I
misunderstand
do
Heidegger? I mean,
believe so because I do think that there is a static element in the fourfold because the point is not again that human beings should maybe modify the surroundings or really become the arbiter of the world in a sense that they rule over it, but in contrast Heidegger simply says, as he calls it, dwelling in
mm.
the fourfold structure, maybe in a sense in a bit subservient way. So I do believe that there is a passive element here.
And this is what he criticizes, that to dwell means to be at peace, to be preserved from harm. And he thinks that uh, ignores the fact that human life goes through contradictions and struggle. Uh,
Yeah, indeed.
that's why he calls it quietism. And certainly, it's like as if Heidegger represents this deep longing for um, quietude and silence and easy living, suggesting a kind of nostalgic view of the past that might play a role here. And we shouldn't forget the way Heidegger was dwelling and the way he lived in this
Yeah.
little cabin, this house deep within the Black Forest. Um, yeah, so maybe this is indeed a very powerful critique of Heidegger. Let's move on then for a moment.
In my phenomenology of spirit, I described the process of self-consciousness as a struggle, a series of conflicts and reconciliations, wherein the individual ego is repeatedly transformed and sublated. Similarly, I would argue that the fourfold is not a static entity, but rather a dynamic, dialectical relationship, wherein the earth, sky, divinities, and mortals are in a constant state of interaction and transformation. Thus, I would propose that the fourfold is not simply a framework for understanding human existence, but rather a moment in the larger dialectical process, a moment that is itself subject to the contradictions and reconciliations that drive human history and consciousness forward. The individual, in dwelling on the earth, is not merely at peace, but rather is caught up in the dynamic, dialectical interplay between the fourfold and is thereby transformed, elevated, and sublated. In this sense, Heidegger's fourfold can be seen as a manifestation of the absolute spirit, a moment of unity and reconciliation, wherein the individual finds their place within the larger context of the world historical process. But, I must insist, this is not a static unity, but rather a dynamic, dialectical one, wherein the individual is transformed, and the fourfold is itself sublated in the ongoing process of human history and consciousness. I must say that I...
Oh, so there you have it. There you have it. So the fourfold is a static concept. It's merely part of the dialectic process. It's not the full description of being. I can imagine Hegel, from his perspective, saying something like that about the fourfold. But to my surprise, this AI rendered Hegelian perspective does include something positive, and I think that is correct. And the positive being that human beings do exist within, let's say, modalities of the absolute in their immediacy. This is a very important point, I believe. The absolute is being conscious of itself within human beings, and the existence of human beings reflects the nature of absolute spirit. So what then can the fourfold mean? Well, a kind of immediate connection that everyone has, let's say by nature and even without thinking about it, an immediate connection with this absolute in these different modalities. I'm not sure that Hegel would approve of the idea of mortality here, but he would certainly approve if the fourth element would be something like historicity or facticity. We are indeed living in a historical context, and our whole world is an historically grown world. We have something to do with this upright, vertical dimension of understanding ourselves from a particular point of view, an ideal or a concept, or let's say something like the state or society or law or justice. They are like these divinities that also, let's say, attract us and allowing us to live in a very concrete manner. The earth we talked about before. So I think I can understand that Hegel is would be both critical, but also appreciative of what the fourfold actually says. But would you agree with me that the basic difference between the two is that Hegel sees this process of mediation as the most important element here, and Heidegger, as always, I think, stresses the immediate form of it, the immediacy of the four dimensions of the fourfold being present in everything. Everything manifests itself within this fourfold. Would you agree that the immediacy versus the mediation of history is actually the basic point here?
Yes, I would definitely agree here because it seems that in Hegel's case, the fourfold is not what is always there, regardless of the very transformation of history and how the spirit drives human history forward, as he said, with contradictions, mediations, and this continuous dialectical process. So I do believe that it is somehow bound to and in relation to and also gains from and give to the human history, which really stands above it, so to speak. So I do believe that there is a very big difference here. Yeah.
Can we finally go to another point? Somewhere in the essay, Heidegger stresses that the fourfold is actually a unity. They're always connected. They're always present at the same time. Would you think that we should be thinking about a dimension beyond the fourfold? Isn't there something in, let's say, Buddhist philosophy um, that brings you to the point of saying, well, um, maybe things in their manifestation and human beings in their manifestation have a deeper source of their being than whatever happens within the fourfold.
Yes, I would say in Eastern thoughts, particularly in the context of Zen Buddhism, it can be said, I think, that the fourfold and the four elements may be one sort of a layer. It might be one layer, but when you actually look what stands beneath it, there is an even deeper layer that I believe
Mm,
holds in a state of a oneness and nothingness at the same time. Because when we say that the four elements here are merely categories generated by our consciousness in the world as a result of us continuously framing things and failing to see things as they really are, that is, nothingness without essence, without qualities, or without categories to which they belong. So I think if we subscribe to this idea of a Buddhist enlightenment, where you abandon all your mental framings, conceptions, and also presuppositions about the world, that this belongs to this element and the other belongs to that element, we can even say that fourfold, the division between the four elements, because Heidegger clearly splits them into four parts and analyzes them, although he
yeah.
does claim that they have a sense of unity. So I would say in Buddhism, we can reject the division into four parts as a general and say that there
Mm,
indeed is this sense of oneness, but this oneness rejects to be split into four parts because that's all mere human mental conceptions. So yeah, I would definitely say that there is a sense of oneness that stands beneath it that can't even be divided into four parts because it is just oneness in its original
mm.
sense. Yeah, of
But
course, in
that
this
brings me to
context.
my final question, because we have compared Heidegger and Hegel a little bit.
Yeah, indeed.
Is it possible that this deeper lying unity that um, becomes visible in the Buddhist approach, that is closer to Hegel's idea of the ultimate unity, in the sense that um, for Hegel, the absolute spirit would be something that manifests itself in the fourfold. For Heidegger, the fourfold would be the immediate presence of being as such. It is the manifestation of being without having any kind of distinction between being as such and then the fourfold. Um, and I think what you said in Buddhism, um, simply the fact that you have distinguished them, even though you call them one, essentially, but you have distinguished them, is, let's say, a lack of understanding of the ultimate unity of everything. That seems to suggest that when Hegel says spirit manifests itself also as fourfold, that is closer to the Buddhist idea. Because I think Buddha would not deny that in our experience, things manifest themselves as varied and different, etc. Is only saying that that is not the reality as such. That's closer to Hegel, I think, than to Heidegger. What are your thoughts about that?
I think definitely will be a lot closer to Hegel, which I think enabled, I believe, in 20th century, initiated the efforts in Japan by Japanese philosophers who tried to draw from Hegel and complement it to their own version of Zen Buddhism and tried to come up with a synthesis, so to speak. So I think this
Yeah.
element
Interesting.
very much explains that as well. Yeah, indeed.
Okay. Sehwan Park, thank you very much for this
Thank you very much.
discussion.
It was a very
And
nice talk.
okay, great. Maybe we'll see each other next time in the next episode of this
Yeah,
podcast.
sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Okay,
much.
there you have it. Wonderful and deep ideas by Heidegger, the fourfold. Um, Very much to be appreciated at this level of immediacy. Things appear within this fourfold. It makes sense. But then you get this, let's say, a twofold criticism. Hegel's criticism, it's a static idea. We should look upon it as part of the development of the spirit. And it can only be one stage of it. It cannot be the final answer to the question of being. And then we heard Sehwan speaking about this Buddhist approach in which the unity, the oneness of reality is taken way more seriously than in Heidegger's thinking, even. Because Heidegger talks about this unity as a sort of immediately given, and Buddhism really attempts to give us a pathway to achieve this sense of the unity. That we have to move beyond the manifold in order to really intuit it and understand it. So, in some interesting idea in Heidegger, but maybe philosophically there is reason to think that it is not the most perfect way to describe the way the absolute manifests itself, or the way that the ultimate unity of reality is present for us. I hope you have enjoyed this conversation. Thank you very much for listening and watching us, and I hope to see you next time.